Hello everyone, today we talk about the peasant religion between 6th and 7th century Italy at the time of the pontificate of Gregory the Great. I think this is an important topic that we only hinted at on some occasion, essentially discussing the importance of figures like Gregory and the great sum of values and cultural legacies that the papacy took on itself in this context of early medieval Europe. A situation that, especially in the Italian peninsula, was pretty messed up, but that now we have to contextualize a bit more broadly into the rest of early medieval Europe, right? So, looking at times and space, and we know essentially that the process of Christianization of the European continent took a while. This process was not just a religious phenomenon. It was sometimes even environmental. I mean, the expansion of Christianity went along with different forms of sedentarization, of settlement, excuse me, that entailed indeed sedentarization on certain occasion and reshaping the spaces for what the ones that had been left available, and therefore changing the let's say the lifestyle, the communities, and readapting to what the local resources could afford you. Because this is not a strictly, obviously, this hasn't to do properly with the phenomenon of Christianization, but we know that a quite deep and in massive element of Christianization took place in this context of great material poverty and of general contraction of early medieval Europe. If you go into the medieval society playlist, you realize we have been talking substantially a lot about this phenomenon and how it affected the continent. There's this death, or better, let's not make it excessively tragic, I mean a transformation of late antique culture that was definitely dramatic in its outcome, but that in certain areas was, let's say, worse than others, right? And therefore this triggered also different forms of experimentation at levels of the forms of Christianization, right? It was very important, for example, to have, I don't know, a unitary kingdom in a certain region that had embraced Catholicism rather than having one that was still Arian, or maybe one that has still not formed, right, as a broader picture. So the church makes a big deal of, let's say, tries to catalyze the construction of monarchies by essentially supporting them, and in exchange, of course, for the support to the spread of Christianization in itself. Christianization had expanded already, let's say, in a fashion that, although we can't literally detach from the ecclesiastical organization and the hierarchy as a whole, but that went beyond the same church. I mean, Christianity was in many ways an option that at the end of the day wasn't even in contrast. And this is very important to understand, actually, because as soon as you say it, many people will not believe it, or will not be prone to understand it, that it was not in mutual exclusion with paganism, especially in those areas where paganism was effectively in charge, because the rulers were still pagan, etc. You can see that the spread of Christianization took place, and obviously in that sense not in a violent form, because it started being known there were missionaries that arrived and sometimes did create problem and brought also to the same, say, martyrdom because of the resistance of the local cultures and tradition to certain attempts to do more. But at that point you realize that it's more than just the establishment of an ecclesiastical structure. It's also a political, maybe, the definitely the clergy was a sort of avant-garde of the Christian kingdoms. Think about the expansion of the Carolingian Empire, how important the clergy was in even not just spreading Christianity, but also in keeping it, safe, sound, let's say, in regions that orientatively had been opposed to it because it had entailed, more than anything, a military conquest. Think about Saxony is the most famous example, of course, where the local clergy, Carolingian clergy, was essentially also deputed to literally control and spy even what the local communities were doing. But that's an extreme, right, of the story, and especially in those places that theoretically were more distant from the Mediterranean civilization and Christianity as a whole, these monotheistic forms, because the societies were simple at the point of not having even developed into polytheism, but still being fundamentally sort of animism of sort. Well, you realize that at that point Christianity spread in a kind of a positive sense. Like there was no imposition, there was not even great resistance after all. Sometimes it took a relatively few time, like in case of, I don't know, I think about Iceland. It took like 2 generations. It happened very late in time, but it partly, it stemmed from a coexistence of this different views of the world. We can even talk about 2 different religions as if they were comparable. Like you can't compare what was Norse paganism with Christianity, because they didn't. They were not at the same level. They didn't talk. And that's the reason why paganism by itself was not even, strictly speaking, a problem for Christianity itself, because definitely Christianity was more exclusive in relation towards paganism. But at the same time, as long as the local communities didn't fundamentally spread other corruptions, like, I don't know, certain heresies and stuff like that, there was no problem. We know, as we will see now, that certain areas of Europe remained pagan for centuries and centuries and centuries after the formal Christianization of the rulers, of the elites, right? So it always starts from there, and so you can measure religion in a sense, especially from a political point of view rather than from an ideological point of view, right? Excuse me, I drink a little before we go on. So, having said this, the appeal of Christianity, there had been in this tormented world torn apart by invasions, epidemics, war, etc. A sense that the let's say this salvific monotheism and its conversion to it would be some sort of beneficial action, and also because this entailed the participation to certain communities that were objectively oriented, especially in the poorest areas, as we will see today, because this is fundamentally our look at the story. They were essentially functional, especially monasticism, to respond to the needs of the local populations, right? We know that, in fact, even relatively to what we said just now, there was a superimposition many times of Christianity fundamentally on the local cults, right? Certain monasteries, certain saint figures were fundamentally not literally substituting or erasing or destroying what existed before, but they were essentially starting from in parallel or even in association with these local beliefs, and then eventually taking over in a context that went that became Christian more and more, right? So that at one point we don't have to think that paganism was erased by just what simply some Christian arrived and destroyed the shrines and everything was. No, it took many centuries. Centuries in which the same communities would grow attached to the same Christian cults and would be forgetful, consider what the education at the time was, of certain aspects of paganism as they had known it before. And definitely these beliefs, as we were saying before, remained a lot. Like, you can't even be converted to Christianity, but even skipping belief in your agrarian deities or entities, because this is particularly important to understand that paganism, especially in the countryside, wasn't even about a certain, well-defined polytheistic structure. It was fundamentally a set of, it was a view of the world that entailed certain forces that had their own, characteristics that intervened, and these were extremely ancient. I mean, some of these cults had survived from before the Aryan invasions. Like, it's important to understand that always at a social level, right? The peasantry in itself has always been kind of passive in that regard to whatever the elites were doing. They were essentially working for them, and the elites built other models, other ways of thinking, other cultures, if you want, while the countryside was this very silent yet kind of resilient world that kept its own beliefs and ideas. And this is important to understand because we do not know much about that world, and it's also a mistake to try to describe it as kind of a world that was always worried about the usurpation or maybe even the elimination of their own beliefs, because their beliefs were all one with the way they lived. I mean, they didn't, to them, I don't know, when they harvested, when they looked at, the cycle of seasons, stars, I mean, to them, that meaning remained the same, and it was objectively no cultural interest by anyone, but even by the elites to discuss that, right? As long as it didn't become something so, in fact, complex, which paganism at that point couldn't become, to become a sort of alter ego to Saint Christianity. And that's why, for example, heresies like Catharism or Bogomilism, or even in the Islamic world, certain Neoplatonic takes on, think about Shia Islam, etc., were essentially part of the same monotheism, and you can see in there definitely the permanence of certain beliefs that had existed before, but these were beliefs that were actually very advanced. Like, these were Gnostic and Neoplatonic ideas that back in the day, we discussed them the other day when we made that video on the Severian literature. We're part of the ultra intellectual elite of what the Hellenistic world had been. So the most advanced thing that had ever existed in the Mediterranean and in Europe. So rural paganism, what was it really like? It was really about the actual agrarian life, the actual rural life. And in this way, it was very simple. It was very spontaneous. It was very natural in all sense, and it didn't. It satisfied. It satisfied by itself. There was no potential at this point for these rural communities to become somewhat more, powerful, more, let's say, autonomous to make a new pagan civilization emerge from this. Absolutely not. The crop rate was abysmally low. The surplus was something practically unperceived even in the range of generations, especially in this point. So it was a very static world, right? And it had even gotten worse from some century onwards. Maybe for the rural communities, not excessively, meaning that, well, it depends. Because definitely, it's also a matter of, at that point, how these populations had lived. Because one thing is being, a peasant into Northumbria, being a peasant into southern Italy, right? That those are completely different social structures, different also work systems, and essentially the big difference had been done by the great Roman latifundin back in the day, that at that point had not really eradicated the rural primitivism of certain areas, but that fundamentally had seen even the employment of colonists that had been previously citizens and people that had abandoned the countryside for a while. So these are very complex dynamics. Then now we don't have the time to analyze them, but we will do it in the future. In part, we already did. But the important thing is to bear in mind, in this sense, always try to, we cannot know what it was in the mindset of a 6th century European peasant, right? We will never know it, unfortunately. But we can understand much of that context, and to imagine in part what it could be like on the basis of how these people actually lived, right? And that's where Christianity got clever, and why we talk about Gregory the Great today. So the process of Christianization wasn't, in my opinion, particularly traumatic in any possible sense, much in the countryside by themselves. I mean, if traumas had happened at that level, that had occurred from the top, from great political and military events, from, as we said before, the invasions, the epidemics, the destructions that occurred in many areas. So that has specifically not to do with Christianity. We don't know of, even if you consider, I don't know, maybe a struggle between the Orthodox, let's say the Catholic Byzantines against, I say Catholic because you know that there is a difference. We talk about Byzantines, we talk about Orthodoxy, yes, but that's a kind of distinction that we need to do from the schism onwards. Actually, at this point, the Nicene Creed is Catholicism, meant as universal, basically, as kataolon, which means through the wall, the ensemble. So you can see, for example, Catholicism versus Arianism on certain occasions, but at that point it's more like the empire versus certain Romano-Germanic kingdoms, where this problems of the conversions are conversion to, in fact, either to Christianity in the first place, because some were still pagan, but from Arianism to Catholicism was a strong political problem within the elites. It's not that people could give a damn about that. It was not even a way to control the local beliefs. This is also important to understand. How do you think that 6th century or medieval the medieval civilization as well had the coercive means to change, to alter directly the beliefs of the local? I mean, it was practically impossible. So it definitely goes in terms of political and social, let's say, systematizations that haven't much to which ideas follow as a consequence, but that take in fact wars and massive socio-economical changes to bring to a certain change. And at this point, local powers had barely the ability to extend, to extend their rule within their boundaries. So it was a very serious situation. And however, in this generally in this picture, we can't say that it was completely a pacifically continuous line, right? The Christianization didn't pass through a simple acceptance, but through certain changes and tensions and setbacks sometimes that were in fact mainly dictated by politics, by the elites. And as we were saying before, Christianity didn't develop, if not very late, and perhaps not even ever completely, in a uniform and homogeneous way in the European territory, right? We could digress even in here by observing certain population dynamics that have to do at this point with the way the same ideas spread. For example, Christianity is a religion of the book. If you can't read, of course you can learn. You can learn the Bible. In Middle Ages, certain people, I mean, at least clergy, knew. At least some of the most gifted knew the Bible by heart. There was a lot of, in fact, oral traditions. The same paganism was about, because these people couldn't write. But in that sense, it made a difference. For example, being in a mindset in which you know what writing is in the first place, and you know how to use it daily, which happened in certain areas, especially in Southern Europe. We'll take this was completely different into Northern Europe, for example. Maybe not so radically different in terms of the countryside itself that represented the majority of the population, but definitely we talked about the difference between the degree of urbanism into Europe, and generally speaking, when you have a city, you have higher degree of literacy, because where there is a city that manages to stand this period, it's because there is enough surplus to even to develop certain activities that serve to maintain this thing functional as a community, etc. that require literacy, and we do know by massive evidences that literacy was used, right? So never fall also into this idea that the Middle Ages were a sort of dark hole that was all homogeneous, by the way, right? That never had some kind of progress, that there weren't differences, that there were worlds where fundamentally the ancient world began and ended and the medieval world began, because this is becoming historiographically very controversial, especially the more you grow distant from Northern Europe, that has somewhat monopolized, especially with Anglo-Saxon historiography, that the popular picture of the Middle Ages, right? Objectively, countries like Britain, for example, but this happened also for others, even in Southern Europe in part, and they had a very traumatic passage from the late antiquity to the early Middle Ages, a really traumatic one. So, and obviously Britain also had its own, characteristics, its infrastructural levels, let's say, that made that society developing in a very different fashion from others, right? That instead maybe didn't feel that passages as something extremely traumatic, and where lots of things stood somewhat in continuity with the previous part. And so it's obvious that alongside with Christianity, we also have more documentation of the realities. We know very well, for example, about how the conversion to Christianity happened in Gaul, and the conversion of the Franks that happened after, as a direct consequence of the conversion of King Clovis at the beginning of the 6th century. We know how only in 589 the Council of Toledo sanctioned the official conversion of the kingdom of the Visigoths from Arianism to Catholicism, right? We know how the Longobards that penetrated in Italy between 568-69 had a tormented process of conversion from their Arian confession, that however was pretty mixed, blended together with strong pagan persistencies, right? And in this list we don't count, of course, those populations that were more distant from the Romanized world, and that only very late in time would pass to Christianity. Just think about the Saxons that we mentioned before, that will be in fact forced to conversion by the arms of Charlemagne in the last fourth of the 8th century, and even a bit beyond, because it took some time to curb them. But even on that occasion, you can see that effectively, there was not a coming back. So it means that after all, those structures that the Carolingians imported there were solid enough for making this, the local culture even adapting to them, right? So it's difficult that, even by thinking that Carolingian control on Saxon communities was very capillary, but I think that easily that there were de facto some pagan communities in northern Germany, even up to the threshold of the modern age, right? It would be anything strange, especially in the countryside. So, of this landscape, today we decide to concentrate more particularly on Italy. So Italy has a very interesting history because it's fundamentally the land in the whole southern Europe, so in this intensely Romanized area, Italy, where's that what the Romans started from, that had actually the strongest trauma of all in the passage from late antiquity to the early Middle Ages. The Longobard invasion is often considered for the peninsula as a deeply traumatic event, but this is, in my opinion, wrong, in the sense that, of course, the Longobards changed a big deal. I mean, if the Longobards had not come into Italy, lots of things would have been different in this world, for sure. But the most traumatic change in absolute terms was not the Longobard invasion. It was actually the Gothic War, right? Which doesn't mean that now it was the evil barbarian. Now it was the Goths. No, it was not even the Goths, because actually the Austro-Gothic domination of Italy was basically the best example in absolute terms of coexistence and cooperation between Romans and Germans that ever existed historically. And but we all know that what happened to Italy with Longobard invasion is something extremely particular that, now that I think about it, doesn't quite happen in any other regional let's say context at this point. That is that fundamentally the peninsula that had a somewhat unitary asset, let's say, excuse me, that you can equate it essentially to Spain, to Gaul, to Britain, right? So these areas that also hosted their own Romano-Germanic kingdom, and that are more neatly shaped. Excuse me, I drink a little before we go on. Was fragmented from a political and territorial point of view. What does it mean? Well, it means basically that the Longobards, when they come into Italy, very differently from what would happen in a few generations, were actually very fragmented. Basically, they didn't have any clear understanding of what a unitary direction was. I mean, they were all a set of clans that, being guided by a king, let's say, when entering the peninsula, they started going without any monarchic control wherever they wanted. So this backfired to the Longobards themselves, because objectively at that point, given the state of the Byzantine garrison into the peninsula, the Longobards had numbers to easily overwhelm the whole Byzantine resistance had they been united in some form. Instead, they basically scattered all over, and so the peninsula became dotted with all this pretty fragmented, let's say, political disposition, for which, from one side there were the Longobards, from one side the Byzantines, a few kilometers of distance, and this in turn brought to a sort of militarization of the peninsula in many ways. As you know, I made a playlist dedicating it to the Longobards. So if you're more interested into Longobard history, I will keep talking about them. So it's important because there are so many prejudices towards the Longobards. Frankly, I are devoid of any, as we know now, historiographically speaking, devoid of any value whatsoever. But there was one factor, since we're talking about Christianization, that caused, let's say, a general problem especially in the ecclesiastical administration of the peninsula. In fact, that, as we said before, the Longobards were not Catholic, and they brought alongside with them this set of pagan, let's say pagan-like, because theoretically they were Arians, so they were Christians, but most of them, especially the majority of the people, were still pagans, right? That had actually constituted the only, at that point, the only gluing ethnical element of the population, right? If there is something that really had kept the Longobards together, was this belief that they had a common, let's say, origin based on their on their essentially military character. The fact that they were Odin's adoptive sons, and they had been actually very inclusive towards other populations, but they had managed to integrate them in a way that their strength had always allowed, and even internal balance in wealth distribution, because the Longobards had a very solid middle class. That's partly what the aristocracies never took over, and there's also this fragmentation occurred initially because they didn't quite have a real chief at the end of the day. There had been some attempts actually to create a sort of dynasty, probably at the time of the Huns, or even as likely before, for the sake of the leadership, having a leadership during the migration that was, however, very slow. So, but basically the people refused that. In fact, the Longobard popular tradition is ethnic tradition is probably a popular tradition, right? It talks about the people. It doesn't talk about a king. It doesn't talk about kings. It talks about the people as such. And the Longobards were extremely proud, extremely soaked with these beliefs, and they strongly believe in them. And that's part of the reason why the Longobards actually never tried to imitate the Romans in any way. Basically, you find a sort of imitation of Roman models from a political and institutional point of view everywhere. You find terms like emperor in Visigothic Spain, in Frankish Gaul. Hell, you find it even in Anglo-Saxon England. The Longobards never betrayed, in this sense, their Germanism, right? They did a freaking deal, freaking lot of let's say of ethnic inclusion when they were in Italy, at the point that basically at the end of the kingdom, all the inhabitants of the kingdom, regardless of their origin, believed themselves to be Longobard, all of them. So, and this actually speaks for the extreme success that the Longobard political and social models achieved in Italy, especially in this world where in fact, the latifundia of the great senators had gone destroyed during the Gothic War, and therefore all these colonists that had partly even been freed by the Ostrogoths exactly for fighting against the late antique model of the latifundium that the Byzantines wanted to keep in standing, actually, had sympathized largely. The Romano-Italic populations had largely sympathized with the Germanic model of settlement. I mean, this idea of essentially small and middle landowners that were out there on their own. They were essentially free men, right? This is very important because when the Longobards come into Italy, they probably applied the usual hospitalitas measures of taking 1/3 of the land, probably even more, given with the fact there was basically no great deal of a Roman elite standing anymore. to of the local population and creating partly slavery, in part this kind of servitude. But on the long run, we see clearly that in a few generations, basically, Longobards and the Romano-Italics blended in extremely fast, and that's why this system was so successful. So the problem with this is that uh, Italy remained divided between the Longobards and the Byzantines. And surely the Byzantines, as the Roman Empire, included Rome and the papacy. Now, the papacy had this enormous problem because it was in a very delicate situation. From one side, you had the Longobards, so this Germanic population that had settled in Italy and basically still, is formally hostile to Catholicism because their elites, their kings, at a certain point they start electing after like 20 years that were in Italy, or even slightly before, are Arians. So they pose themselves in opposition to the Roman Empire. Right? Always remember this. That being Arian in this context means to not to really give a damn about the actual Arian, let's say theology, right? The heresy of Arian. But basically saying, okay, we are Christians, but we still don't want to, so we don't want to be part of the empire. This is important because the Germans had converted to this Arian Christianism essentially to be more acceptable at the international level and at the diplomatic level for the empire, because they had recognized they had to deal with it, and it was the most obvious and omnipresent interlocutor all over Europe. But at the same time, they didn't want to be incorporated by it. At least, so that is the message. And obviously, in this context, Longobards and Byzantines fight each other pretty hard in Italy. At one point, the Byzantines make intervene twice the mobile army. So the big guns, and they even make the Franks come into the Po Valley, and this pincer movement that fails. So the Longobards actually managed to defeat their enemy, and at one point with the plague, etc., the Byzantine resources are completely exhausted, and by the beginning of the 7th century, basically the Longobards are always on the offensive, right, and they will progressively erode all Byzantine Italy. Now, the problem is that there is the papacy in the middle. Now, we know how it's gone in the end, that the Byzantines are good for nothing for the Pope at one point, so the Pope calls the Franks, but we are in the late 8th century. And that brings to the end of actually not of the Longobard kingdom as such, but at least of its independence, because Charlemagne actually becomes king of the Longobards, and the Italic kingdom, it also survives into the Holy Roman Empire, is essentially the kingdom of the Longobard. Institutionally speaking, it's the same thing. But the problem with the papacy at that point is that they became like the tip of the balance for the situation in Italy. Why? Because essentially the papacy was developing at this point as a sort of autonomous polity within the same Roman territory. Rome technically belonged to the duchy, to the Byzantine Duchy of Rome, right? And there was even a Byzantine garrison up to a certain point. Then eventually the Romans basically began to defend by themselves, and even using this scolae of pilgrims coming from France, even from England, of these communities, now Christian communities that inhabited in Rome in certain quarters, that had their own militias that they even used, for example, to fight against the Saracens and so on. So it's a very interesting history. But the point is that the papacy is developing fundamentally its own ambition. We have made a video here on Schwerpunkt on the Roman primacy of honor, all the composition that this entailed with Constantinople, that basically of all the great metropolitic seat was the only one that had basically no Christian history, because all the others had been places of martyrdom of the apostles, starting from Rome, of course, that in this sense had the real primacy with Peter and Paul, Constantine had to basically take the relics of the apostles from elsewhere and bringing them to Constantinople in order to give them some aura of sanctity, right? And obviously Constantinople was the capital of the empire, and now there was this conflict with Rome, also in terms of doctrinal issues, because essentially the Byzantines were trying, even beyond actually, but especially before the Arab invasions, to wink at the Syrian, Palestinian, and Egyptian heresies that were spreading, even as a form of autonomism from Constantinople in terms of orthodoxy, etc., by bending a little bit in an heterodox sense. And in this sense, in the early Middle Ages, what the Latin Germanic Europe, headed by Rome, was actually very, very orthodox, very proper, very firm in its orthodoxy, while Constantinople was doing pretty weird things. Even after the loss of those regions at the hands of the Muslims, the Byzantines will come up with the iconoclasm and this pretty messed up stories that, especially from a Western perspective, say, but what the hell are you doing there, right? We have. There is a Nicene Creed. We stick to that. Why all this swinging? And objectively, the papacy was doing right. In fact, the Longobards will progressively start to become Catholic at one point, and Gregory the Great will be very important for this. They would actually, but even I think before they formally converted as a kingdom to Catholicism, as Arians, they were actually backing the papacy against Constantinople, which makes a lot of sense, and it brings us back to the point we were making, that fundamentally, the Byzantines and Rome were two distinct things at this point. It would grow more. It's a kind of a big word, because at this point, I made a video on Byzantine Italy. If you're interested, should be in the Byzantine history playlist. It tells you how Byzantine Italy was very fragmented, actually not less than Longobard Italy, that was a much more unitary polity than is often told. But I don't know, Rome was something different than Ravenna, for example, the capital of the Exarchate. There were the Venetian lagoons that were basically on their own. There was southern Italy and Sicily that also were kind of different. There was Sardinia, lost in the Mediterranean. And Rome was crucial in here. Rome here was the largest, after Constantinople was still literally the largest city in Europe. It had declined, yes, and it had gone depopulated, especially during the Gothic War, where it was even abandoned fully at one point. The Goths had destroyed the aqueducts they had during the siege. It was a pretty messed up situation. There were like 2 or 3 sieges of Rome at that point, the problem here is that, however, the Byzantines didn't quite have the strength to control such a big city in the distance, and Rome as a city, as a community, was fundamentally a center of power of some sort. There was an aristocracy, there was the papacy, there was this very strong control of the Roman Church on a lot of land, and not just in Rome and in the surroundings, but especially before the excuse me, the Arab, the iconoclasm and the Saracen invasions. The popes hold an enormous amount of land in southern Italy, like an enormous amount of land, and so that was a pretty important. I mean, that's also a branch that's very interesting to study, because the southern Italian history was pretty messed up in the following centuries. So even the papacy, the papal links to it would be quite quite swinging at one point, basically, especially with the loss of the Arabs. The loss of Sicily to the Arabs, but that's quite late. That happens between the 9th and the 10th centuries. Basically, Rome will kind of shrunk into this more than a Mediterranean, a properly Italic dimension, and that's where the relations with the Byzantines are cut off, and that's why also incidentally at that point the strong link with the Carolingian Empire And but this is not what we're talking about today. What we're talking about today is that basically Rome now and the Pope, which ruled it, um, uh, not fully, because like the popes never controlled directly like all the city, right? Basically Rome will not be controlled by anyone fully as a city up to the late Middle Age, up to the 15th century, basically, because it was such a big city and kind of courageous. I mean, the local aristocracy, the local community were pretty kind of even warlike. They had this sense of they were extremely jealous of their prerogatives. At this point, always remember that Rome feels itself the if not the capital, but the center of the empire. Like Rome is, if you live in 6th century, 7th century Europe, well, Rome is the center of the world. What do you think that has ceased, that has ended? It didn't happen like that. That is still perceived as such. And especially the papacy at this point has more than a local control, but an enormous influence and prestige all over Europe. And Gregory the Great is that is important for the Byzantines because, of course, in order to control Italy fully, they must have the Pope from their own side. And sometimes he will be not. Secondly, from Gregory the Great, in particularly, there is this enormous extension of the relations of the Roman Church with wide areas of Europe. I mean, probably one of the greatest successes ever of Christianity in this point is the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons. That is of enormous importance for all Western civilization and its impact at all levels. And it was achieved at this point at a distance that it is what it is, even more than 1,000 kilometers. But just with this strong ecclesiastical coordination that occurred from Rome, from which the popes literally told in the letters what they had to be done relatively to the organization of a local church in England and in all the other areas of Europe. And this connection is very important. It's something that now we don't have maybe time to explain, but it was even a sort of response, in my opinion, to the Byzantine influence. Like the idea that the papacy and this larger Latin Germanic world could basically feel something on its own, even before the Carolingian times. It was deeply rooted. Like there were these nets of relations were very instrumental to the strengthening of the local powers, whether it was the papacy of the various Romano-Germanic kingdoms. And it was a great work of not just of evangelization, but of civilization, of idea, of spread of culture, written culture, of idea. Rome was really the center. It was the directive point into this, and Gregory the Great, the greatest pope of the greatest popes in absolute the whole history of the Roman Church. And so this, let's say that the Roman Church, as we've seen, had problems basically also with the Longobards, as we've seen. Now we will observe how the general relation with the Longobards will improve, especially under Gregory the Great, especially thanks to the relation between the epistolary relation between him and the actually Catholic Queen Theodolinda, that was a Bavarian but had married the first Authari and then Agilulf, that were both Arian kings of the Longobard, but that will essentially start the process of Catholicization of the Longobards. That was fundamentally much more pacific than we can think. Now the problem the Longobards had previously to this attacked Roman territory, even besieged Rome at one point, and looted around and taking captives and selling it to the Franks, etc. you know, as a Byzantine territory fundamentally, right? And that was a sensible thing to do, meaning that, you know, taking Rome, or at least showing this capability of besieging even just a city like Rome. It was massive to have, with the Aurelian walls, with this, but more broadly, the enormous prestige that it had from a political and religious point of view. What was quite of a big deal and a good move. But there was never this, let's say, this strong enmity between the Longobards and the papacy as two, you know, as the two polities as such. Of course, in late Longobard times, you know, when the Longobards basically start wiping out the remains of the Byzantines in the peninsula, Rome is worried, and that's why they call the popes called the Carolingians, and so on. And it's at that point that the relation goes straight, but not because of Rome in itself, but simply because in Rome there was both a pro and an anti-Longobard faction, right? In the sense, a pro-Longobard and a pro-Frankish faction. So history might have gone very differently. There might even easily been a kingdom of the Longobards with Rome incorporated, and maybe for other reasons the Franks would have not intervened into Italy. It was an option, it was a possibility. What we can say, though, is that we mostly, in fact, the greatest prejudices that exist on the Longobards, historiographically speaking, were on the base of what the papacy told about them, right? It's like that, just like with the Vandals, for example. Was not much of a matter that they were, you know, that they even sacked Rome at one point. It's because they were Arians, like, so there was this, and they were controlling Africa, that, as we've seen, you know, that at that point Italy was quite related to, talking about the 5th century, of course. But to make it simpler, let's say that that at the time of the Longobard invasion, especially all these clans of Longobards that swarmed into the peninsula started doing pretty messed up things. Like they even destroyed the Abbey of Monte Cassino in the first destruction, and eventually they will be the one of the Saracens. But these were kind of like bands that were roaming around without even a clear geographical understanding of Italy. You know, I mean, what could a Longobard of the I don't know, of the 6th century know about Italy as such? You know, what is that? You know, some even went across the Alps into Burgundy to be defeated eventually, or they, you know, the same creation of the kingdom actually happened more with for reasons that were of self-defense than actually expansionistic ones. Then eventually, yes, as soon as they formed the kingdom in 584, if I'm not wrong, or 85, I don't remember, they will state quite clearly that they were kings of Italy, of all Italy. It was a pretty powerful message to say to the Byzantines, look, here we command. But that was a bit the point. It was a bit of a subtle, maybe not so subtle threat even to the autonomy of Rome. So when this was the initial situation, the Pope obviously freaked out. You know, the Longobards at one point, for example, when they occupied Tuscany, they seized, for example, the Byzantine galleys that were in places like Pisa or other major ports, and they start, I don't know, raiding on Sardinia. And we have Gregory the Great letters that say to write to the Bishop of Colors, telling, you know, watch out, because there are these guys around the seas, and, you know, they will come again about, you know, attacking the city, and so on. So that's the first negative picture. These Longobards that are Arians, but practically they're still pagans, and that they harass the Byzantines, and the Byzantines still have the offensive capabilities to attack them, and so on. And that's where we had the messed up thing, like, you know, the nefandissima gens, so these most awful gens of the people of the Longobards. And then in later times, during, you know, the Carolingian, you know, with the relation with the Carolingians, by saying, you know, we need the help against the Longobards because these are the brute barbarians, but They were by the late 8th century. They weren't. They were actually the most administratively advanced kingdom, a Romano-Germanic kingdom that had ever existed. They were fully Catholic by that time. And yes, they did have aims on Rome, but if you instead study the whole period of Longobard history and in the middle, you see that it was fundamentally a pretty pacific kingdom that didn't quite have strained relations with Rome, and much of these relations were in fact set at that point under Gregory the Great, right? Because the Longobards at that point were essentially interested just in eroding the various the Byzantine territories that were still out there, and practically nothing else. They didn't have this overwhelming momentum. We're talking about the 7th century, a moment in which even the resources were very shortly available, and so on. But let's say that even, and I was thinking about it today, that this broader connections that, for example, Rome intertwines with, for example, with Gaul since a very early age, with the Franks, and they're much more ancient to the ones at the time of Charlemagne, and also the one with the Anglo-Saxons, and less with the Visigoths, telling the truth, but sometimes with the barbarians, with other peoples that were, but chiefly with the Franks, were an instrument of political. Let's try to find allies that can protect us here from the Longobards. If we, as the papacy, were not this enormous power with armies and offensive capabilities, let's find, however, allies, and let's stress our own prestige, even in the eyes of the Longobards, who objectively will in fact convert by the mid-7th century to Catholicism in a very slow process that, however, bore itself not a real hostility towards Catholicism in itself. And in this sense, it would be more interesting to look even at what the Longobard perspective of the situation is, because today we will talk chiefly about what the one of the papacy was at one point. But the Longobards, and obviously the papacy produced more about, also historiographically speaking, than the Longobards did. In perspective, the Longobards left a lot of documentary and administrative material. It's very interesting, that show us there was a pretty well-ordered society at one point, had been fundamentally Romanized, was very literate for time standards. It had a efficient public administration. Things worked well, but tendentially we don't have much of the Longobard perspective of the story, if not by at the end of Paul the Diocesan, that was writing actually seemingly on behalf of Charlemagne about the Longobards, for presenting naturally also kind of more let's say normalized history of what it's a beautiful story, but obviously, and very realistic, very important, but at the same time it misses many parts of what the broader perspective was. Also, Paul the Deacon wrote essentially from the mostly Friulan perspective that wasn't much of the one of the Neustria in Lombardy, and in the Western Po Valley was the true center of the monarchy in itself, with Pavia, etc. But the point is that even also the Longobards had an interest in fundamentally in not being opposed by the local episcopate that was largely Catholic. It was a problem of the Longobards that they were ruling as Arians on a Catholic population. This is the same thing that happened, to the Burgundians, to the Goths. That's how it had been. But this didn't lead actually to persecutions. We will see now there were certain, references to certain violences, but we have basically no evidence of a structural persecution of Catholic. There is literally no evidence of sort of anything like this, and it wouldn't make sense after all. And we know, on the contrary, by a lot, especially in the in terms of documentary production at at the monarchical level, that especially in the north, in the Po Valley, where the kingdom was founded, and that had its center. Well, there was a huge deal of contribution of Roman literates to Longobard, to Longobard culture and government. That, like, it's evident, like in these great cities of northern Italy, like Pavia or Milan or even Verona, etc. There was, by the way, at the time, some basically after Roman Constantinople, the largest cities in Europe. Let's be honest about this. The Po Valley was actually, from ancient times, not a big deal of development. It was mostly centered in southern Italy, where the wealthy. The Po Valley had basically enucleated itself a bit of something on its own. But let's say that for early medieval time standards, founding a kingdom in there was a pretty clever move, because you know that also continental traffics passed from there, from the great rivers like the Po one through the eventually through the Alps in Central Europe. So this continental dimension would bring actually northern Italy in high medieval times to surpass the wealth of the south and to become more developed. Also thanks to the Longobards that worked from the cities, had this efficient administration, they had a functional legal system that was pretty damn effective, and it remained standing up to the 11th century, even more in certain regions of the south, and it would even trigger the recovery of Roman law, because all those who did that were Longobardists at the time. So there's a lot we could talk about the Longobards, and once again, you know, I readdress you to the playlist I made about them, because they're very fascinating. But the idea was that at one point they were somewhat cooperative with their own episcopate. Like the point is here that it's not that they attacked Rome or other Byzantine territories or destroyed places like Monte Cassino. Those were basically there was an official warfare, especially in the Po Valley at the beginning, that brought to certain destructions like scorched and land strategy, but that's exactly also the Byzantines did. So that's motivated. The destruction of Monte Cassino, that is objectively a pretty heavy blow, and what we see here that then in Rome everybody was very upset by that, but those were kind of wandering bands. But the concept is that because that was Byzantine territory, right? While in the north, we have no evidence of persecution. We know that Catholic communities and bishops were still there, right? Other kingdoms, like Arian kingdoms, like the Vandalic one, for example, had taken out the elite, the Catholics, the Catholic bishops. They had substituted them with Arian bishops. The Longobards do not do that, and on the contrary, they are quite supportive even of Catholic stance during the Tricapitoline Schism against Constantinople. So it was their destiny to become Catholic in many ways. Also, the Longobards, when they migrated in Italy, they were a lot for migration era standards, like we think like 100,000 people, but still Italy was overwhelmingly populated. So aside from certain areas that were less urbanized, etc., the Longobards had also more ethnic impacting effect, like in Friuli or in Spoleto or in Benevento. The same Longobard population was quickly absorbed by the rest of the Italic population. And that's the destiny of all the Arian kingdoms, like at the end of the day, to become Catholic, right? So it was just a matter of time. But talking about Gregory the Great, so without knowing how things would have evolved, but in a time in which the Longobards had already arrived and just arrived, and the Byzantines were at war with them. So the situation was pretty desperate, because Italy, after the Gothic War that had happened a few decades ago, was still exhausted, right? The resources were lacking. It was a big problem. Entire areas went depopulated. It was a disastrous situation. Well, they had, the papacy, Gregory the Great in this case. Gregory the Great was pope between 590 and 604, right? They had to essentially present a model, a political, social model, obviously passed through to an ecclesiastical one, a Christian one, as now we will see how. They had to win, let's say, the Italic populations over, in competition with Longobards, but also in part with the Byzantines, right? And that's why Gregory the Great is so important, because he developed a truly Italic episcopal sense. Like it contributed fundamentally to the idea that Italy as an entity was a polity that was fundamentally directed spiritually by the Pope, right? And that was not just a spiritual guide, but also essentially had to present a sort of political and social models that could be of appeal for this extremely impoverished populations, especially in central Italy, right? So in these areas that had been hit pretty hard actually by the Gothic War, that were largely Apenninic areas, so there weren't this enormous they were mostly mountainous and rural areas, right? So areas, however, that were very important from a strategical point of view, because even the Byzantine presence basically stretched through between Rome and Ravenna through this Apenninic corridor that had to be defended and guarded, was full of garrisons of castles, etc., against the Longobards. So it was a matter of winning the populations, because it was understood that if you won the population, the Longobards could make less, could have a harder time to expand their power. And as we were saying before, this from the side of the papacy wasn't. I mean, the Byzantines had a completely different mindset at this point. I mean, Italy had become, especially in the 7th century, kind of a relatively peripheral area, right? They knew that it was fairly rich in spite of all, even in spite of the disaster of the Gothic War, but it was still very peripheral to Constantinople that had different strategic interests. So Italy will always remain important for the Byzantines, but there will also be sort of forgetfulness towards it, and especially for the center and the north, that at one point could not be realistically recovered either. So winning these local populations was very important for the same Pope to win, in part, the favor of the Italics, in a certain sense in competition, but not even against the Byzantines on certain occasions. Why? Well, of course, because the papacy had its own local ambitions. It had understood in that sense that they were really the tip of the balance in Italy. There's a letter that we have by Gregory the Great that actually states something to the Byzantines that is very harsh, actually. That it says, you have to think that he said something like that. Now I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember, but it says something like, if you always bear in mind, dear Constantinopolitan Emperor, that if I want, as a Pope, to reduce, for example, the Longobards to obedience, I can do it. And then that's a serious problem for you if I intend to do that. So don't strain too much here don't exploit the fact that the Longobards are problems also for us, because if we want, in theory, we can even that can even backfire, because we can turn the Longobards against you as well, more than you can, and more what you can do in here, because here we are in Italy and you are not, and so we know here how things work, and you have to tribute influence to us. And this was done obviously also because of the whole international and ecclesiastical Byzantine policy that obviously wanted to reduce the papacy to a sort of just one metropolitic seat, like the bishop like the others, right? And always tributing the primacy of honor to Rome as an apostolic seat, but not essentially devoiding it of actual power, right? And that's why the popes during the Middle Ages know how to play this decentralized position of theirs compared to the empire, very, very well, pretty damn well, and already with the intention of extending their power over the peninsula. Right, theoretically, the papacy felt itself entitled, since Constantinian times, to have a, in terms of on the wake of the ecclesiastical repartition of Italy, to enter in possession of certain, basically of controlling directly, like secular rulers, basically all of essentially of central and southern Italy. And this is something that they even asked to the Carolingians at one point, when the Carolingians were asked to intervene into Italy. The idea is that, we make you intervene to Italy, we appoint you kings and whatever, but you have to give to us all of Italy, like literally from like the Po Valley to the Straits of Messina. And obviously that never happened, because Rome by itself didn't have even the power to do that. But theoretically, the popes knew that having those rights recognized would pay off. And actually, great part of what would become the papal states is actually being started from that point, juridically speaking, right? A lot of land that obviously the papacy would battle over with the Holy Roman emperors for all these regions of the Median Belt in central Italy, from in fact they resemble a lot, in fact, the ancient corridor between Rome and Ravenna, right? Ravenna, who in turn had also its own ambitions in that regard, because up to that point, objectively, no bishop was meant in an ecumenic sense to be over someone else. I mean, so it was rather the papal mindset was that aggressive in that regard, although basically all the other Western churches did that, because basically if you look at what the councils of Toledo were doing in Spain, well, they basically wanted to recreate a sort of empire modeled on the Byzantine one, with a kind of a ruling church in it. The Gallic Church was essentially backing the Merovingian monarchy as a sort of mega monarchy with imperialistic ambitions, and on, right? Also, the Anglo-Saxon kings will use at one point ecclesiastical possessions for doing that, so for strengthening their power, I mean. So this is the picture in which we have to frame what we know, and always bear in mind when we read the works like the one of Gregory the Great, we have to bear in mind, in fact, this specific perspective, because otherwise and knowing, by the way, that we don't have much of other people perspectives, like what the Longobards, for example, thought at this time, or also what the Merovingians thought. I mean, it's not so clear. Like the popes, from the top of their classical legacy and education, obviously they knew a freaking lot, and how to use this spiritual and literary weapons to tell their story, their version, right? And in fact, as we were saying before, some of the darkest picture of the Longobards actually emerges from the papal scriptorial, like that's obvious, right? And the Longobards suffered in turn of this, because definitely the intellectual and organizational capabilities of their own clergy, as well as also the institutional system of their own church, was kind of less less steady than the Roman one, that was instead pretty damn well structured, right? Also for other reasons, how property was distributed in there, but the simple fact that Rome at one point comes to rule in its own territory on its own, right, without Byzantine control. So during as we were saying before, the Longobards arrived into Italy in 568. And after a while, they killed basically two kings, including Albvin, that had led them into Italy. And from 574, when Clef gets killed, there is this 10-year period that lasts, in fact, up to 584, that is known as the period of anarchy, right? Because there was no king. I mean, the Longobards didn't elect another king, like their customs instead, had required up to a few times before. And the reason is that the Longobard dukes wanted to do what the heck they liked on their own. So the moment of the anarchy was the most messed up moment in Longobard history, objectively, aside maybe from the very last years of the kingdom where the Franks were invading it. But this is basically the only time in which from papal chancery we get news of violence to the Roman populations, to push them to accept pagan cults, with the ensuing crown of martyrdom for those who existed, according to what at least Pope Gregory says, what happened to 40 rustics that had been made prisoners and that refused to eat certain meat of sacrificed animals. This is from the Dialogy 327 from Gregory the Great. I will see now in a short while. Now, how to interpret this? Well, of course, that there probably was at one point this that we know that when Agilulf besieged Rome, the local peasantry, the local the catacombs and were profaned, and the peasants were taken like serfs and sold to the Franks, which is also interesting because the Franks were fully Catholic at that point. So that tells you what the dialectic of power was it really, instead than just a religious one. But it's obvious that from Rome that was besieged, it was all about the fact that the Longobards were some martyrs, heretic bastards that did that because they were fundamentally pagans, right? And terrible and evil, right? But that's basically what every single polity did at the time, when they entered into enemy territory and they started taking captives and selling. I mean, the Byzantines did it, the Franks did it. I mean, it was a standard at the time, so always bear in mind of this. There was objectively a long and tenacious effort for the penetration in certain vast areas that was subject to rites and beliefs that were proper of the Longobards. Like there is this common memory, for example, in the Longobard Duchy of Benevent, to which the Longobards maintained, seemingly for a very long time, the cult of the golden simulacrum of the viper, or also known as the rite of the holy tree. That had to do, it was a military thing, basically. If I'm not wrong, it was this Longobard cavalryman that kind of made a game for which they had to pierce the skin of a viper that was tied to a tree with a or if I remember correctly, with the tip of a spear. That's obviously a military game, but that was sacred, like, in itself. So this was typical, actually, of peoples like the Germans, like pagan contexts, and they're in Benevent. They simply maintained it. So this was seen, however, as a terrible thing. Like, look at this, guys, what they do. They think that vipers are sacred, they're pagans, and so on. But these beliefs, as we said at the beginning of the video, remained largely in many places of Europe for a very long time. So here, just think about what the political reaction is. It's the idea that here the Longobards are fundamentally wrong because they're pagans still, or they do pagan-like things more than else. So this thing, for example, is this practice is witnessed in the anonymous life of the bishop. I mean, it's a work, the Vita, of the Bishop of Benevent Barbatus, at the time of the Duke Romuald I, Longobard Duke, between 671-687. But hey, well, still the 7th century. These guys had come there from basically more than 1 century, and yeah, they did those things. But Come on, what's so wrong? Excuse me, I drink a little once again. So, as we were saying before, what really made the difference in the history of the relations between Rome and the Longobards was Gregory the Great, between 509 and 604. And Gregory was basically responsible at this point for converting them, right? That was the main goal, after all. That was the main weapon the Roman Church had, by converting. Because if you convert to Rome, you start this net of relations that makes everything easier, because the papal legitimization to some monarchic rule is a pretty effective way for the local population, especially when it's overwhelmingly Catholic, like in this case in Italy, to support the king, right? So it's all a game of power, and both the popes and the Longobards played together very well. So Gregory felt at that point very well the problems of his own church, but also the ones of the religious life of the people of his times, both the laymen, the clergy, and the monks. The same Gregory belonged, similarly to the Jansenichas, so one of the most prominent, most educated, noble, and powerful and politically influent late antique Roman families that and the same Gregory started actually as a layman. He studied. He worked into the Roman administration. He also had eventually he became a priest, but he also had a monastic, let's say better, an ascetic experiences. So he had basically lived throughout all the spectrum of layhood, of as a layman, as a clergyman, and even as a monk in a certain sense. A chapter we should spend maybe. Oh, okay. We'll talk about this. Monasticism here is the key, right? Basically, having lived in these three dimensions has presented you with the main, let's say, social and spiritual realities, but also political realities. Telling the truth. Given the importance of Christianity in the world, in that world now, of the time. And we have a very meaningful witness in here by his work, his very famous work, De Miraculis Patrum Italicorum, known as the Dialogy, with the title of Dialogy, so the dialogues. The Miraculis Patrum Italicorum simply means about the miracles of the Italic fathers. So thinking about, obviously referred in a Christian sense to the religious, the most prominent religious figures. And this work was composed by Gregory between 593 and 594. So in this work, the Pope offers certain models that are capable to address the religious behaviors, and together with it basically tells us that what makes it also so precious about a lot of existing real situations in the Italy of the late 6th century, right? And the most the strongest models, right? The most intense models that are presented in this work are relative to the bishops and the clergy, but even more by the monks, right? This is very important, extremely important, and thinking about monasticism and all what it entails at this point. What monks are at this point are basically laymen. Don't think that this is just anecdotal, right? There is a strict differentiation. We talked about this on Schwerpunkt. If you go into medieval Christianity playlist, you will find this stuff. Between the the different the different dimensions, lifestyles, and opinions, and education, and views of the world, if not divisions that existed between the clergy and the monks. To draw a very sharp line that it doesn't, probably is not very useful, but it still gives an idea. The clergy is mostly about the city at this point, in the dioceses that stood into the Roman cities of Western Europe, on which the diocese districtuation was based, and the monks. So those are priests. So they are people who are ordered, who have a ministerium. Actually, the monks are not. The monks are laymen, and they're basically no ones, right? It's not that they have any specific value. They're simply the most average Christians that go out there and start to live in a way that obviously is resemblant of the one of Christ, but also of these other models that had poured from the East, where monasticism has firstly spread, I mean, from Egypt, from areas of the Near East, and they were pretty famous in the Roman world, in late antiquity, especially in central and southern Italy, and in southern France. Southern France, especially with the monastic center of the Lérins island, that is also a beautiful place. I often went there in vacation, close to Cap d'Antibes, where Napoleon landed after he was imprisoned in the Elba island. That is also a good example, because in that case, that's an elite monasticism. Basically, everybody, the monastery on the Lérins island was joined by the youngest people of the greatest, the aristocratic families of the cities of the Rhone Valley, right? They were just in the front on land, and basically in that specific area of Provence, monasticism had been all one thing with episcopal culture. Remember that the most important, the most cultured area of production in late antiquities in terms of from the clergy is southern France, is Gaul, especially in this in the Rhone Valley, in these cities like Arles, and these major centers of the area that incidentally are very well connected with Italy by sea. That's why the Po Valley was a bit something aside, because basically the major trade routes passed directly from kind of central Italy to southern France. They didn't get via land through to the Po Valley at this point. Or at least, well, some did, but they were not preferential roads. And that's a good example, because it shows you that the clergy and the monks could be kind of the same thing, and there was a lot of prestige attached to monastic life experience, right? So that is particularly important. The monks are fundamentally those laymen who have chosen to separate themselves from the world without entering into the ordo clericalis, right? So into the clerical order. However, they have left the world for a very serious mission, because they want to carry out they want to live out there, practicing chastity, poverty, contemplation, usually in solitude, but at the same time also in community, meaning that these monks, even it can be strange, but they were first of all always in contact with someone. Like medieval monasticism is never about complete isolation. Like the monastery has a mission that is to show to the rest of the world how theoretically the whole humanity should live like. It's a model of sanctity, and the same monastery is conceived as an imitation of the heavenly Jerusalem. And the 6th century Italy and Gaul are very important for the development of especially Western monasticism, because the Byzantine world had already its own ancient traditions, and in the West these were much more experimental. The West at this point was really the far West, was really the kind of wild and the kind of primitive world that had declined more than the East, and that where it was full even of spaces, of areas that were abandoned, and where the forests and the swamps had taken over. So that maybe were not even very far from the cities, right? But think about very urbanized lands that, like the same Italian peninsula, where you have the main cities on the coast, but a few tens of kilometers inland, you already have the Apennine, and that's a pretty wild place, right? So this is a moment of great. Together with the general impoverishment, the sense of insecurity and precariousness, the monastic choice is a choice, but sometimes it's very in line with the rest of the population and lifestyle of the population, because in fact people are so poor that they do not have such a different lifestyle from the one of monks. That people come back to inhabit in caves and using this pretty attempted refuges, and it's a dramatic situation. Think about all these peasants that maybe had successfully survived from the Gothic War, and now after a few decades, where they maybe had managed to put everything together. I mean, everything, like something, what had a few that had remained together, is Longobards arrive and start invading and pillaging and so on. So it's quite there's this idea of insecurity, of precariousness from all the Italic sources of the time, differently from other regions. Always, let's stress this, that Italy, together like Britain, is one of those places where like a traumatic change occurs. Like Gaul and Spain, for example, didn't have this. They had a different story, and obviously by different degree. Not that nothing bad ever happened there, but still there was a greater continuity with other models. So the talking about the monks, it goes without saying that the environment of such proofs of such choice is not normally the city, meaning that there are monastic centers in the city in itself. Rome is plenty of that. Rome has still one of the most precious monastic centers of that time, dating back to even Roman times, that survive and are expanded. In fact, the Rome of Gregory the First is one of it's great in terms also of expansion in this structures, etc. However, the monks that achieve more success in this sense, and that Gregory wants to highlight, because they're sent out there like sort of missionaries, and they fulfill their task, even in as we will see now how they are living in other areas, right? The city. It is true that the cities by themselves, aside from these major centers, are declining in many ways. Like there are entire cities that are abandoned at this point, or other centers that are. I mean, Italy is one of those places where you can't really say that the city disappears as such. That happens, especially in certain areas of Northern Europe, etc. In Italy, what happens is that there are mostly kind of of course, a demographic contraction, but a relocation of the population in other minor centers. And maybe sometimes we're a bit more elevated on the sea surface. They were a bit better defendable, and that's kind of part of that militarization that we were talking about before. And so where these monks operate is really at this point the rural and mountainous areas of Central and partly southern Italy, right? And so in here we have the incredibly I mean, saying famous, it even sounds reductive, figure of Benedict, Saint Benedict, patron of Europe, born around 480 and died after 446. So these are, think about the date here. It's basically Austro-Gothic Italy up to the mass of the Gothic War, right? So Saint Benedict, I mean, no, I don't want to enter into other matters, but some even have problems in identifying him as a historical figure, for the simple fact that actually his regula, so his rule, that would become so important, so that basically during the Middle Ages, every single up to the Dominican orders, basically every single monk thought of himself as a Benedictine, right? And that's why it's patron of Europe, because objectively it's Benedictines that evangelize Europe, right? Still is an obscure figure in this Italic context about which we know dramatically few, and he's one of the relatively many other figures that wrote rules of life for the monks that were kind of a sort of literary genre that existed in fact in the Christian community, in the monastic communities. It was plenty of that in Italy, was plenty of that in Gaul. Actually, seemingly came mostly from Gaul, as we were saying before, that was one of the most developed centers. But let's say that objectively the Italian fathers that Gregory the Great writes about are this more these more radical figures. I mean, that they objectively they live in a much tougher environment than the one of southern Gaul. They do have a tougher life in general. They struggle more. They have to live with less, and they are generally, in fact, also poorer people, more ignorant people, if you want. You know, the Benedictine rule, even if associated to the idea that you had to pray and work all together, it's fundamentally a quite a materially oriented rule. Like it's basically the essential for the survival, and you have to pray, so you have to have your Bible in your monastery, that theoretically at this point it can't even be a hut, like with a few, with a closet you have maybe just one Bible. This is something extremely precious, even from a material point of view, and then all the other tools, for working your vegetable garden and stuff like that, because the main problem there is literally to survive, right? So the figure of Saint Benedict, aside from the debates of whether he was the actual creator of the rule, because actually Saint Benedict's rule, that's a point I wanted to make, is partly inspired also to other rules, and that they circulated were also shared. Like, oh, let's look at this rule, let's adopt it, let's not adopt it, because it was full of these monks that spontaneously went back and forth. It was a lot of movement, and it was even trans-maritime movement. Many monks migrated to islands, as we've seen before. There were many in Corsica and Sardinia, for example, in between Italy and France. However, Saint Benedict has this heremitic phase, and eventually he has this unfortunate story of a reformer of monasteries that is extremely tough, and he endly arrives at this new, let's say, innovative experience, let's say, of the monastery of Monte Cassino, right? So we can, in this general, literary genre and a geographical horizons, let's put it in this way, concentrate on the lesser known but still pretty interesting human and Christian adventure of the monk Aequitius. So Aequitius is father, this saint, at least in the Catholic Church, I believe, also in the others, even in the Protestant ones, that is father of many monasteries in the Valeria province. Now, the Valeria province is, according to Paul the Deacon, the 13th province located between the regions of Umbria, Campania, and Picenum. Right, so it's basically is fairly broad area, essentially central in parts of southern Italy. And the story of Aequitius has to do that is recalled by Gregory the Great in his De Miraculis Patrum Italicorum, is about a character that witnesses quite extensively the intensity of the religious demand of certain environments that were normally considered at the time kind of rough and primitives, like the one of the countryside, right? This is important because, as we were saying about the figure of Gregory the Great, and I made a video about him. It's like Gregory the Great in the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons. I mostly talk about him though. And as we were saying before, he came actually from one of the most prestigious family in Rome. So then he was the Pope. Like, it's not these guys were normally elected from the aristocracy, and so these were people who had also remained a bit tied. This was the ancient senatorial class that now was the episcopal one, right? So this transformation had happened, but the aristocracy in itself was always the same. And looking at the model of the countryside, that is, what could the Romans care about the countryside? Like, they lived in Rome, the center of the world, the universal city, the holiest city. Well, no, Gregory the Great is extremely smart. He understands that in order to cope with the situation that has been produced with Longobard invasion and the relation with the Byzantines, that talking about these models is crucial, right? And this is not just about the countryside, it's about talking about monks that are fundamentally no ones, as we said before. They're literally everyone who can do that. While the clergy, instead, was part of the aristocracy. Like, being part of the clergy was being, in charge of something, of some money, of some power, of living in the city and making it function, because basically now the city was run by the clergy in practice. Like, run by the clergy, maybe it's too much, but let's say many, for example, Gregory the Great had a huge deal of administrating the resources for feeding the mob of Rome, there were these important logistical infrastructural problems in the administration, hosting the pilgrims that came from all over Europe and the Mediterranean. I mean, it was quite a big deal, right? So talking about monks, it was a way, as we said before, that maybe sparked a bit of suspicion about from the side of the clergy. Said, but these guys are maybe just, not necessarily fanatics, but people who were rough or ignorant. Who, it's not like us, where we have studied, we belong to the clerical order, we know how things are, and we can't rule this. No, Gregory perfectly understands how important these figures are for winning at the end of the day, the majority of the population, that is the one that is starving in the countryside, right? And with which Rome also has obviously some nets, because another enormous historiographical topic here is, what was the episcopal net at this point into Italy? Because at one point it collapsed, basically. There were entire dioceses who disappeared after the Gothic War. Others were relocated. About most, we don't actually know what the hell happened. And a diocesan net is not just about saying, here there is someone who calls himself a bishop and rules about this. It's a bit of a deeper thing. It's something that has to come from the above and has to keep things in order and control the relation between these dioceses that also have, by the way, their own territorial pertinence. So they struggle over property and borders. This is something that was going on. There was a beautiful documentation of an inquiry carried out by the Longobard kings in Tuscany between actually Perugia and no, it wasn't Perugia. Yeah, maybe, yeah, but I don't remember. And Siena, however, that ironically enough were part of the Roman diocese. metropolitic pertinence. So that was basically some land that theoretically belonged to the Pope from an ecclesiastical point of view, but that was in Longobard territory. And we know about the fact that basically the population gravitated around this diocese. Like the bishop, the local bishop was a sort of administrator in the absence of other major, there was a Longobard duke, etc. But most of the times it was these communities that were quite powerful on their own. They shared power actually with the Longobard nobility and administration. So it's quite interesting. And however, what emerges from the figure of Aequitius that we were saying is this pastoral orientation, right? There is even there is probably some attention, some maybe a religious awareness of lay people that in here it wants to be emerged, is that it was not every. I mean, people were poor, but some of them were literate. Like there was this, even a realization that among the monks there were people who also came from the city, that also had their own, that could be connected culturally to the city, right, and that therefore could be used by the papacy to control the territory and to expand Catholicism even into Longobard territory, even in other lands that were still not Christianized even. So Aequitius, the history of Aequitius is similar to many other geographies. He basically frees himself from the youthful temptation of the flesh by divine grace, and he founds a monastery. But he also begins a infatigable work of itinerant preaching, against which the same clergy actually starts having its own suspicion. And this is very interesting because it's the Saint Gregory writing about this. In fact, at one point he writes in Latin, quote, "Quis est iste vir rusticus, qui auctoritatem sibi predicationes ripuit, et officium apostolici nostri domini sibi imet usurpare indoctus presumserit." So this means basically, who is this rustic person, man, let's say, who basically assumes for himself the authority of preaching and the apostolic office of our Lord, let's say that presumes to usurp as a ignorant man the apostolic office of our Lord. This is very meaningful because Gregory is expressing here, he's making a work of civilization. He's trying to make even the Roman clergy understand that the monks were valuable figures, that were worthy of admiration for what they were doing in their holiness, and that could be, become part, let's say, of the ecclesiastical net of control and of communication, let's say, of organization of the local communities, right? Because the dioceses were crumbling, so these guys were effectively the only ones who could speak at a deeper level to the local populations, like the bishops that couldn't maintain a diocese, couldn't do anymore. So to this rhetorical question that we have read in Latin, Aequitius had already given an answer that basically led to his own licentia predicandi, so the license of preaching by divine initiative, right? So he was basically called by God to preach, right? So it was simple as that, and it's a very Christ-like example. Like it recalls obviously the Jewish priests that accuse Christ of being an impious, an impostor fundamentally, and that's basically the same parallel that is being traced in here. And the most important thing here is that the same Aequitius states that even if he had wanted to subtract himself to his duty, it would have been impossible for him to, here it says in Latin, de deo tacere, right? So to not to I mean to remain silent when about God, right? When he was called by God. So this rustic, as it's called in the source, devoid of culture in cultus, went around for roaming in countries and castles on the back of a donkey, bringing alongside in his bag the Bible, the Holy Scripture, what here are called as the Sacros Codices, so the Holy Codex, like the holy books, and explaining the Scripture wherever, like quacunque pervenisset scripturarum aperiebat fontem et aperiebat prata mensium. Right. So this is always quoted from Gregory's Theology. It means that wherever he went, he opened the source of the scriptures, and as a consequence, it opened the fields, literally the fields, the how do you say in English, of the mind? Yes, but the whatever. The meadows, let's say better, the meadows of the mind, right? This is what it means. So, Aequitius, like, after all, the same Benedict, were models, right? They're literary models. Let's be honest about this. That's where you have to be, I mean, aware enough about historical, why things are written, and that we're not talking about individual elements, but like kind of that what is written is real history. Everything is mediated in one another. These are models, but they still tell us how and why they are those models, and why they are used for what they have to do. And in fact, these models represent in themselves certain rather unique experiences, or better, they indicate as signals of what the Christian should be, right? The perfect Christian should be, just like he was imagined by Pope Gregory. So with the reality, in fact, the two monks clashed necessarily. I mean, there is, in particular, the Aequitius action remains an episode of a very short length, like given that the preaching of a mission of a that is not been entrusted with an apostolic mission is not nor will be in the future easily accepted by the church, the institutional church in itself. But besides, let's say, constituting the spice of certain questions and real ferments of new forms of religious life, these examples represent the birth of a peasant religion. Right, this is being highlighted by certain scholars that at this point society has turned overwhelmingly into a rural reality, right? So Christianity has to adapt to it, and that's where the geniality of Gregory stands. That he goes beyond what the late antique models of Christianity had been, right? Relatively to the regalia, to the authority that the emperors had conferred to the church from as kind of a persecution of same imperial ruler, obviously in a spiritual sense, but de facto not, meaning that the fact, as we've seen, the church was ruling in this place, and therefore he was talking to the same clergy at this point, not much to the countryside that evidently couldn't read and didn't give a damn about this, but he was showing to the clergy of Rome, and consequently to also the clergy of the whole Europe, what those monastic models in extreme poverty at a rural level could mean, and what they could mean for the local population. right? And therefore, this enclosed rural world, the rural dimension, that, however, was what the base of the world had turned into now. So such religion finds its convergence points and its, say, moments of growth in the monks that are the men of God, that become the paradigmatic figures in Christian life in Gregory's work, and who made themselves and who are at this point peasants among peasants, right? These are people who live in the countryside, that work like the peasants work, that sweat like peasants sweat, that work very hard. Ora et labora. This is Benedictine motto, like precept. You have to pray, but you have to work. You have to make it true, because this is your life on earth is a mission equally, and you have to work for yourself, but especially for the community, because if you help yourself in this sense, you show what it needs to be done, and what we can all benefit from, and this is all imbued with the sense of of reliance in the hands of God, in which nature, just like for the peasants had been for their ancient pagan deities, it meant to have a deep trust in. Like if I sow, if I harvest or collect the harvest or olives, if I work in my vegetable garden, I'm hoping fundamentally that God will will help me, will give me. And this is a moment where it's not a happy, I have my little garden, and no, you're starving, because if I don't know, a storm arrives or there is a famine, whatever, you're done with. You don't have anything to eat. You have to go out there in the wild, and I don't know what. Like, in fact, in these geographical works, maybe not in Aequitius, but in many others that appear also later in Christian literature, there is a lot of the figure of the animal that sometimes symbolizes, even thinking about the deer. There are all these Christian references to the animal, the Christian Christ's symbology, etc. That, for example, that feed the monk in places where there was literally nothing to eat with their own milk, or there is this strictly survival dimension. Where the monasteries are founded. The monasteries are found in these terrible places. They are so dark. There is nothing. There are ferocious animals and so on. But either maybe the ferocious animal becomes nice, or maybe the monk finds this little valley that is so cute, and it gives just what it takes for surviving, for the natural for the natural subsistence, and that's obviously a divine gift and a model in which, in fact, the monastery is built like a bit the Garden of Adam of Eve, right? These are models, literary models, geographic models, will be developed and be very famous also in the following centuries. But it starts especially for medieval Europe in this way, and from these figures like Benedict and Aequitius that are so symbolic, so inspiring, right? So these are, by the way, excuse me, very simple stories, right? Very simple stories. But that's what it has to be, because the countryside is simple. People are simple. What, at the end of the day, even the Christian message is, it's extremely deep, it's extremely powerful, but it's simple. Jesus' words are simple. Everybody can understand them, right? So this is the true message. Is this the reconnection with God in sufferance that the Christian has to expect in his life, because otherwise it wouldn't be a true Christian. And sufferance helps, but at the same time, and this is the interesting thing from an anthropological point of view, is that still in this world that also from a cultural point of view resents, obviously, resents, no, not in English, resents means another thing, but reflects the needs of the local cultures that also were maybe not so spiritually oriented, right? So hence not the purely spiritual thing, like, well, I will stand here until God will give me to eat, essentially, and the person would die, right? Obviously, a Christian hagiography couldn't write anything like this, and therefore the introduction of the worker of the land is like a peasant, like a farmer, is of an enormous importance, because it presents with a realistic model of lifestyle that is what the average person would have had to embrace at that point, if he or she wanted to survive, right? So it's very important, very, very important. And therefore the stories are loaded basically with all this story of these actions, like like cutting the hay, or working the land, stuff like that, right? And so besides incarnating the maximal grade of religious tension in a period of dramatic precariousness on basically every front, these monks, the evangelizers of the countryside, are anchors of salvation, literally, for a population that is being vexed by the most diverse misfortunes, the most, all the imaginable misfortunes, right? And this is important because this countryside, even very close to places like well, still also pagan largely. We've seen it before. So looking at these Christian monks that were essentially working and presenting this acceptable, made Christianity more acceptable for this essentially still pagan, or at least very superficially Christianized cultures. Always remember that Christianization is mostly a urban phenomenon in the Roman Empire. So even in provinces like these Mediterranean ones, where the Christianization existed since the beginning in practice, the countryside was still largely pagan, and as we've said before, nobody had really cared about that, right? Because the main centers were cities. So for example, when Benedict, and there are subtle, when Benedict converts people, and there is this part in which the shepherds in the dialogy are described as a bestialimente mutati sunt, so which means that these were changed from their beast-like mindset, right? That at this point is not I don't think in the text here is directly a reference to paganism, but to the sheer lifestyle. I mean, to this idea that, for example, there was a lot of brigandage, right? So there was this positive model that showed people, look, you can live in a kind of a poor but still, worthy way by working and by doing something constructive in your life. This is important. Don't underestimate, in this sense, the anthropological value of Christianity in the founding of Western civilization. I mean, this is really a positive message. It's one of the, especially in those times, right? And it's still very simple. It's very effective. So there is a distortion of this world that seems to be upside down, right? And that into which Christianity tries to bring, the harsh truth of what needs to be done. What is the right thing to do? And the right thing to do, hell, is always the most difficult thing to do. But it works, right? So this is the concept of why these works are so important. In Benedict, for example, in time of famine, gives food and oil till the last drop to the poor, of who by a miracle provides to pay off the debt of a poor man who had rushed to the monastery to ask help to the monks, Now, this is very interesting as well. I mean, if you think about it, aside from the miracles of food and oil, like, for example, there's often in this type of a geography the the following, that the same monks are actually undergoing a pretty harsh proof, like they're living out, outside under the weather, in terrible conditions, and everything goes wrong. Like at the beginning, everything goes wrong. These are not monks that arrive there and God winks from the skies and make okay, and then they all have everything to eat. And no, they have to struggle. They are damned how they struggle, and this is hard for them because they want to give up, and it's natural because they are men, they are sinners. They want to give up. We all want to give up, right? Who doesn't want to give up? Who wants to say, I want to just be free, but we can't because we have a mission in here, and it works. It betters us. We can be better people. We can turn it to something different if we really work hard. So, this fact of saying, we are running out of food, we're running out of oil here, Mediterranean world, oil is also very precious and so on. It's typical, and the supplies are finishing. So at that point, the saint, or maybe a storm has destroyed the vegetable garden, and there is something they can't do, and these guys give up, say that we're done with, we're done for actually, but because we will die. And instead, the saint shows, look, never lose faith, always have faith, and magically, miraculously, let's say better. New food arrives, new oil arrives, and people who were starving to death go to the monks for this. This is great because it means that the monks are forming certain communities of peasants and farmers that they do work well. They do have their own surplus to share with the rest of the population, and their mission, their duty is essentially that. So all these people that maybe are not even, they don't even like the Christians because maybe they're pagan, they don't believe in that stuff. But they look at these people and say, look, these are working, they are producing something, so their gods must be from their side. And they come to the monastery to seek for help, right? And this is a story because eventually the monasteries will grow powerful and will grow capable of becoming seigniories, basically, in this clienteling net with the local peasantry, etc. But this thing of the man that seeks help to monastery to pay off his debt, well, it means that in a world where everything is so bad, the monks are the only ones who have some wealth and that can help a poor person. And there are many setbacks because the church is in turn impoverished and looted because their resources are not infinite. They can help the poor, but they still have a lot way to do because you work so hard for having a little surplus, but you have immediately to give it to who needs that. And let's remember that exactly when Gregory is writing this theology, the same monastery of Monte Cassino is destroyed by the Longobards in the 80s of the 6th century. And there is this punching line. The letter says, our monastery is being destroyed. I mean, this is, and that tells you how deep, by the way, the monastic roots with these new foundations were strong with Rome, who believed Monte Cassino to be their own monastery, our own monastery, obviously as Christians, but also as being proud of having directed it from the papal authority on this, this organization. And so, yeah, I mean, that's meaningful. So the same life of the clergy has somewhat adapted to the poverty of an economy that is partially reduced to subsistence. For example, Gregory shows us the fourth subdeacon of the Church of Bisenzio, or of Volci, that, however, is along this the area of the Aurelia Road, that grazes the ships of the ships, excuse me, of his flock, right? And while Boniface, instead of Bishop of Ferentinum, has a vineyard as his own, as his only his only property, so that he arrives at the point of stealing to his nephew 12 golden coins in order to help the poor. Mm. This is interesting because it's an implicit. It shows obviously the poverty of this bishops, right? These are bishops, and this speaks for the impoverishment of the diocese and their crumbling that we were talking about before. I mean, like a bishop that often was one of the wealthiest figures in the local community that now had, a flock of sheep, or maybe had just a vineyard. So it's a very poor dimension. It tells you, how Italy had been ripped apart by the Gothic War. And but there is also this implicit criticism to this rich nephew of the bishop that has 12 coins of gold, right? So this idea that there is always the rich evil people that have money, they don't want to give to the poor. So yeah, that's a bit of a cliche, but it's still, 12 golden coins is also not a lot. So that tells you that if that guy was rich, well, it was not a big deal either overall. So that's what the meaning of the thing really is. Then there is Paulinus, bishop of Nola, that is so poor to substitute his own person to the son of a widow that had been taken prisoner by the Vandals back in the day. At this point, the Vandals do not exist, at least as a kingdom anymore. So here there is even an emotional, familial substitution that speaks to the heart of communities that were ravaged and that were here taken as slaves and etc. So that there are also these bonds between people into which the monks, in this case of the clergy, actually become part of the same community. They become certain spiritual relatives, right? This is very important. It's a matter. It's a history of solitude, of loneliness, of sufferance. That the whole community comes together, monks, clergy, and laymen alike, to reconsolidate, to rebuild. Now, this is also another very powerful message, and it's very deep, it's very positive, very effective, right? It speaks to the heart, to the conscience of people. It's a deep message. It's a very, very deep message. So at the end of the story, what's the meaning of this construction? Well, of course, that there is a church that is centered on the Bishop of Rome, right? So these heartbreaking examples do not eliminate, of course, the power and the prestige that Rome has and the papacy has, and this international power that it is building, right? Very effectively, very orderly, very cleverly. But it's still, all of this is based spiritually and therefore in terms of authority and power on the Church of Rome. I mean, this is really the Church of Rome that presents this model, that says this is the way we have to take, right? And it's a deep cultural achievement. It's really a great understanding of where this whole continent is going. It's going bad, and we have to deal with that. We can't remain blind or heartless, right? Christianity has to spread from the basis, right? Not from the top. And so this will happen. This will happen. If you go and see those, watch those videos I made, for example, on Christian education during the early Middle Ages, etc. Well, you'll see that actually even education, literacy, was spreading from these bases. That there was room for everybody to share these models, to become essentially a new a new lifestyle, a new form of positive. So not a Christianity like based on just this, let's say, holy character that, however, doesn't do anything, that remains, I don't know, like the stellates on a column, like the Eastern models wanted. No, this is a Christian model that gets into the worst of where people suffer the most, and they help them by working alongside with them. So this will be very important for the same Western monasticism, because it's a way of bonding deeply with the local population. I mean, this also happened in the East. I don't want to criticize now the Byzantine East. I'm just saying that in the West there is also this the less cultured and less Christianized background is somewhat more pragmatically oriented. Excuse me. It's somewhat the individual is more important. The individual action is more important, and this is not just about a Christian different Christian sensitivity. It's really about the fact that the West is more primitive, is more tribal, is more based on what the individual has to do, and that's why Western Christianity will develop, a great sensitivity in this time in history, and will be able to build something very. If you think about it, it's immense. Like what the Roman Church was capable of being de facto, compared to the other organizations, and considering what the Latin Germanic, secular structures were reduced to, right? It's not a few. It's not a few. Think about what, but let's say better. That's in part the success of Rome towards especially areas like England at this point, like Central Europe. So areas that were poor, poorer surely than Italy, but they somewhat resembled them at this very moment at the end of the 6th century, beginning of the 7th, in terms of small and middle property, right? This idea that there is a somewhat a Freeman model that was evidently, in this sense, used in Italy, especially to attract sympathies also from the Longobard side, showing that there could be that it wasn't just about the elites of the Roman Empire that were trying to knock out the Longobard kingdom, also through the elites, but of a participation to a Christian model that started from the base, that reconstructed everything from the base. That is incidentally what the Longobards were doing with their kingdom in a region that had been razed to the ground by the Gothic War. Now this is very important because it was a way to win probably the Longobards, and this is something I'm growing more convinced of, is that the Gregory that of course will start the Catholicization of the Longobards with the beautiful letters shared with Theodolinda, Queen of the Longobards, for doing something like let's stop fighting, let's do something that works for the both of us in a positive sense, and that strengthens our ties, right? So it's deep, right? And it's great, in my opinion, to talk about these things. So, in other words, the Pope becomes, in this sense, the artifacts of a multiform help to his people that is animated by the monks, is backed by other viri dei, so the men of God, fundamentally, that are poor but active, and that therefore present itself as a force capable of redeeming a world in ruin. This is deep as well. If you think it through a Christian view of the world, especially in those times, the fact that the empire had dissolved, that this crisis was evident, in an eschatological Christian perspective, that means, not necessarily that the end is near. That is always near at the end of the day, as a metaphor, but that things had gotten worse. So that if this world could be saved, I mean, it would have had to pass through such humble attitude towards reality, and starting to, but it goes beyond that. It's really an active, aside from Christian spirituality, it's really a contract of cooperation, of a proposal of peace and coexistence that that accommodates us in the hardships of life. I think that this is it. So, for now, I would say it's enough. And I was glad to talk about this topic. Hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you are interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.